The day is approaching when we will have rolled up the world and all that is therein, and spread out a new order in its stead. He verily is powerful over all things. Baha'u'llah. Bend your minds and wills to the education of the peoples and kindreds of the earth, that haply the dissensions that divide it may be blotted out from its face, and all mankind become the upholders of one order and the inhabitants of one city. Baha'u'llah.
Thank you. So today, we're really happy to have Dr. Augusto Lopez Claros, and he'll be talking about the prosperity of the world and the development of nations. Dr. Lopez Claros is Executive Director and Chair of the Global Governance Forum. He's an international economist with over 30 years of experience in international organizations, including most recently at the World Bank. For the 2018-2019 academic years, Augusto Lopez Claros was on leave from the World Bank as a senior fellow at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Between 2011 and 2017, he was the director of the World Bank's Global Indicators Group, one of the departments within the bank's research vice presidency. Previously, he was chief economist and director of the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, where he was also the editor of the Global Competitiveness Report, the forum's flagship publication. Before joining the forum, he worked for several years in the financial sector in London, with a special focus on emerging markets. He was the IMF's resident representative in Russia during the 1990s. Educated in England and the United States, he received a diploma in mathematical statistics from Cambridge University and a PhD in economics from Duke University. His recent publications include Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All, and a list of his recent lectures can be found at augustolopezclaros.com.
Thank you, Paimane. It's a pleasure to come back to your group after a hiatus. And as I was thinking about this presentation, the thought came to me that I would basically share with you a little bit of the vision that is contained in the Baha'i writings about the subject of economics and how to organize in a more fair and equitable way economic relationships in the world at large. And this is a subject that actually has figured prominently in the writings of the main figures of the Baha'i Faith. In fact, the title of the talk, The Prosperity of the World and Development of Nations, is actually a direct quote from the writings of the founder, Baha'u'llah, where he talks about how religion is not just about the inner life of the spirit. It's not just about prayer and meditation and the acquisition of personal virtues. It also has a social counterpart. The reason we want to educate people in spiritual principles is because that will lead to the establishment of institutions and systems which are going to deliver security, stability, peace, prosperity, and so on. In fact, his son, Abdul Baha, in 1875, wrote a treatise called The Secret of Divine Civilization, where he elaborates at some length on some of the principles laid out by his father in terms of what are the elements of a just society. What would be the kinds of institutions and practices one would wish to build in society so as to create the conditions for prosperity and for the development of human capacities. And so that is what I want to focus on. And as it happens, just by coincidence, a few days ago, I was actually last Monday, I was invited by one of the more well-known Spanish universities to give a talk focused on the Sustainable Development Goals and what they actually mean for economics and prosperity in today's very troubled international environment. I don't know whether you are aware of this, but but in 2015, the United Nations adopted a series of 17 so-called Sustainable Development Goals, which provide a framework for the development of policies in all the member countries of the United Nations, with the aim of achieving very important social and economic objectives. Just to give you an example, Sustainable Development Goal number 1 talks about the elimination of poverty, extreme poverty, by 2030. And if you are somewhat familiar with the writings of the Baha'i Faith, you will see that there are very, very strong statements about the need to eliminate poverty and to provide the institutions and the means to, to provide for people and to prevent them, as Abdul Baha once said, from poverty that is demoralizing and degrading. Sustainable Development Goal number 5 has to do with the elimination of discrimination against women and making sure that women and girls partake of the benefits and the opportunities given to men. As you know, again, the principle of gender equality is foundational in the Baha'i writings. And so it's interesting how here you have yet another example of how the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations are pursuing something that is very much at the heart of what we Baha'is believe in. And I can give you several other examples. There is a Sustainable Development Goal that addresses the question of equity, of inequality. And as you know, in the writings of the Baha'i Faith, there is a great deal that is said about the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty, which is the term that was used by Abdul Baha to essentially talk about income distribution and a more equitable distribution of the growth of the benefits of economic growth. And then perhaps one final example, because I thought that this would be the place where I could begin my presentation. Sustainable Development Goal number 16 talks about promoting a peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. Again, here, this resonates very, very strongly with the writings of the main figures in the Baha'i Faith. For instance, this reference to building effective institutions which are accountable and inclusive. Well, Shoghi Effendi in 1931 said in The Goal of a New World Order, a letter that he wrote to the Baha'i world, he said that the reason for the disquiet, for the unhappiness, for the instability of the world was due to our failure to adjust our economic and political institutions to the needs of a rapidly evolving age. So there you go. In 1931, already Shoghi Effendi was talking in some sense about what this Sustainable Development Goal 16 is calling for, which is updating and modernizing our institutions so that they are better able to cope with many of the problems and the global challenges that we face, right? So that's the background. And I did want to share that with you because for me, I am an economist by profession. I have spent virtually all of my professional life working for international organizations. It is very interesting to see how the emerging consensus among professional economists, among governments, and certainly within the UN system, lays out principles which have been enunciated more than 100 years ago by the central figures of the Baha'i Faith, such as the elimination of poverty, such as better distribution of income, such as eliminating discriminations against women and so on. So let me then give you, I have made a list of maybe 5 or so areas that I want to touch briefly to give you a sense of where the Baha'i Faith stands on the whole question of the economy and more generally social and economic development. But before I get started, I just want to share something with you. This is from a letter written by Shoghi Effendi in January of 1936. So that's, a good 92 years ago. Somebody had asked about, what specifically was the Baha'i Faith recommending in terms of the formulation of a vision of what economics would entail. And this is what Shoghi Effendi said. He said that there are practically no technical teachings on economics in the cause. The cause is not an economic system, nor can its founders be considered as having been technical economists. The contribution of the faith to this subject is essentially indirect, as it consists in the application of spiritual principles to our present-day economic system. Baha'u'llah has given us basic principles which should guide future Baha'i economists in establishing such institutions which will adjust the economic relationships of the world. And this quote is fascinating, because it basically lays out the emphasis on the identification of principles, which would then be the starting point for developing the institutions and the policies that would establish, a more sustained, fairer, more equitable economic system. But having said this, it turns out that, in fact, especially Abdul Baha elaborated in great detail about some of these principles laid out by his father. And so that in the end, nearly 100 years later, after Shoghi Effendi wrote this letter, we do have a body of work directly traced, especially to the talks that Abdul Baha gave as he was traveling in Europe and in North America, that give us a very good flavor of what would be the main elements of such an economic system, right? And so, obviously, I have a choice to make here. This is a very vast subject, and so let me identify for you at most half a dozen areas where I think that faith makes a very important, very specific contribution, right? All right, so one of them has to do with what I would consider to be a redefinition of the concept of security and prosperity. At the moment when governments talk about national security, when politicians, people running for Congress or for the Senate in the United States, for parliament in other countries, politicians running for the office of prime minister or head of state and so on and so forth, when they talk about national security, they usually frame the concept in terms that are really militaristic. They have much to do with having the instruments, the armies, the navies, the air forces, the weapons that are necessary to defend our national borders and to defend national interests. And of course, from that perspective, virtually, I would say 100% of politicians running for office would be pro-national defense, pro-national security, because it is regarded as something that is very much a function of the state. When you read the Baha'i writings, the notion of security that emerges is a much broader notion that I think has more to do with what I would call human security. In other words, yes, we may need to allocate a share of resources to have a national defense, to have an army, to have the instrumentalities that are necessary to defend ourselves, from the many evil characters which are lurking around in the world, who mean harm to other peaceful people, right? But beyond that, I think that there is also a sense that the resources that we have should be allocated to meet more important needs of society, which have a lot to do with, human welfare. What do I mean? Well, things like, for instance, making sure that we have resources to educate our young people, to provide the training and the skills to our labor force that are necessary in order for our countries to be able to compete in an increasingly competitive global economy. That we will have the resources so that the next time we're hit with a pandemic, God forbid, our hospitals and our public health system are not put under huge stress, and that a lot of people have to die needlessly because of inadequate spending on our public infrastructure, and so on. I think you begin to get the idea, right? In fact, Baha'u'llah, in an interview that he gave to Edward Brown in the year 1890, for those of you who are not familiar with this, Edward Brown was a very well-known scholar, a Cambridge University professor who was an Orientalist. He was fluent in Persian and in Arabic. He had traveled in the region for many, many decades, intimately familiar with the politics, the religion, the social aspects of those societies. And he met Baha'u'llah in Baji, where Baha'u'llah was under house arrest. And in that talk, Baha'u'llah told Brown, he said something along the lines of, we see your rulers and your kings more focused on spending their scarce resources on the buildup of military establishment and machines for the destruction of human life, rather than in that which we conducive to the happiness of mankind, right? And so he's establishing this kind of prioritization of resources. Don't spend your resources to such a great extent on weapons and warfare and this narrow vision of national defense. Allocate more of those resources to that which would be conducive to the happiness of mankind. Now, Brown doesn't tell us whether Baha'u'llah elaborated on what he meant by that, but there is a lot of other Baha'i writings which suggest exactly what Baha'u'llah meant by that. And it would mean, education and training. It would mean public health. It would mean the kinds of building up the kinds of institutions which eventually improve the efficiency of government, that create greater equity, that protect the poor from starvation and malnutrition, and so on and so forth, right? So that is one element. In fact, Abdul Baha emphasized this, and he actually put it in fairly dramatic language in a talk that he gave again in 1912 in the United States as he was traveling. He said the greatest catastrophe in the world of humanity today is war. Then he refers to Europe and how Europe is on the trigger of a great calamity, which of course happened within the next couple of years. And then he says that, the implements of war and death are multiplied and increased to an inconceivable degree. And the burden of military maintenance is taxing the various countries beyond the point of endurance. Armies and navies devour the substance and possessions of the people. The toiling poor, the innocent and helpless are forced by taxation to provide munitions and armaments for governments bent upon conquest of territory. So you see how strong the language is which he uses, and how, again, he establishes the contrast between the burden put on people, especially poor people, to finance the military machinery on the one hand, and the costs associated in terms of human welfare, right? So that's one area that I think is very important, that we need to rethink entirely our concept of national security, and to think more broadly in terms of human security. All right. And here, let me give you, in fact, an example which comes from COVID a couple of years ago, well, a little more, 3 years ago. The United States, most experts agree, is the most powerful military force in the world. Um, among the many instruments that it has to defend itself are thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons. And my question to you, echoing the words of Baha'u'llah to Edward Brown, is in the middle of COVID, when American citizens were dying left and right. In fact, altogether, more than 1 million Americans died because of COVID in 2020 and 2021. More Americans that died in World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, which are the four most important conflicts in which the United States was engaged, in terms of war, right? How useful during COVID were the thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons which the United States has at its disposal? Not at all, not at all, right? You cannot nuke an airborne virus. The kinds of instruments that are necessary to defend yourself against a global pandemic are completely different than the instruments that you need to defend yourself against a nuclear aggressor. And of course, we all know what would happen if we had to defend ourselves against a nuclear aggressor. It might mean the extinction of mankind. It might mean, World War III and basically the collapse of civilization, something that we don't want to anticipate and that we hope never happens, right? So again, here you have a very dramatic example of something that Baha'u'llah in his conversations with Edward Brown had already identified as a critical issue, right? A question of priorities. And this was echoed again in Abdul Baha as he was traveling in America. I mention these things because, we sometimes tend to forget that the Baha'i faith has a very clear, very strong vision of social order, and especially Abdul Baha, because he is the one who elaborated some of the principles laid out by his father. He uses very strong language, and he has very forthright, very coherent, very intelligent proposals to deal with many of the problems that we have today, such as poverty, such as inequality. All right. Second area, getting a little bit more into the specifics, right? The data suggests that although we have made progress in reducing poverty in recent decades, we still have a serious poverty problem in the world. Okay, let me give you a kind of a statistic. And I apologize, but I'm an economist, and we economists like to work. We like to make arguments based on data, on evidence, right? It's very much part of what we do. At least the good economists, all right. There are some economists who are ideologues, and they like to put forward arguments on the basis of belief, right? But I don't find that very valuable because beliefs are cheap to come by. It's the data that really counts, all right? So let me give you a very shocking statistic, all right? Poverty is actually something that on which we have very good data. The World Bank, the organization where I worked for many, many years as the director of one of the research groups, is the organization that compiles data on global poverty, right? And we define somebody to be poor if his income is below a certain line, we call it a poverty line, right? Okay, so I'm going to choose a poverty line used by the World Bank, which is daily income of $6.85, right? So if you earn $6.85 per day or less, which I guess translates into something like quickly $4,000 approximately per year. All right. So if your income is less than $4,000 per year, according to this poverty line, you are classified as poor. Okay. So the shocking statistic is if I ask you what percent of the world's population lives on less than $4,000 of annual income per year, it turns out that it is 48% of the world's population. All right. 1 out of every 2 people in the world lives on that income. Okay, now you will say, oh, well, this is not the reality of the United States. Yeah, I'll grant you that. You have very few people in the US who have that sort of income. But it is the daily reality of much of the rest of the world. I have traveled to India every year for the last several years, and you cannot imagine the kind of poverty that you see in India, the kind of subsistence level poverty. If you travel in Africa, in the world we have more than 800 million people who are malnourished. Okay, what does being malnourished mean? It means that during the first 3 years of your life, you haven't received the nutrients, the vitamins, the minerals that are necessary for the healthy development of your brain. And as a result of those deficiencies, by the time you are 3 years old, it is too late. You are going to be stunted in your development. And this is not something that affects, a few million people. No, we're talking about 800 million people. We're talking about more than 10% of the world's population, right? So here, I can understand why when Abdul Baha is traveling in Paris and in America and the subject of poverty comes up, he uses very strong language. He refers to extreme poverty as being demoralizing and degrading. Demoralizing, what can be more demoralizing for a mother not to have enough resources so that she cannot feed her children enough nutrition to prevent that child from being malnourished, and therefore to prevent that child from having a healthy brain, which is the most important instrument that we have, in our lives, to learn, to move out, to work, to join the labor force, and so on and so forth, right? So that is the reason why this issue of equity, this issue of Abdul Baha said, creating the institutions that are necessary to prevent this from happening. I don't find Abdul Baha's very strong language in some of the public talks that he gave at all surprising. I don't mind telling you, he's outraged at some of these underlying realities. And, he's traveling in 1912 when the condition of world poverty is very dire, even in places like the United States, to say nothing today of places like sub-Saharan Africa, India, Bangladesh, and, many other countries where poverty is prevalent, right? So this is if you ask me, okay, I'm a development economist who has spent much of his life in development and in working in this space, right? If you ask me, what should be the highest priority for governments all over the world, right? There are, multiple priorities. We want to, of course, have good infrastructure. We should spend resources to have good highways and good roads and, good transportation systems. That is important. We should electrify our countries. Okay. Again, this is puzzling for you because, we live in America. I live in Europe. Okay. Access to electricity is not a problem, right? All these countries high-income countries are fully electrified, but there are 800 million people again in the world who don't have access to electricity, right? Which means that, the children when they come back to school, they better do their homework quickly because by the time it's 6 p.m., it's dark, and they may not have the ability to read their homework, let alone to plug in their computers, which of course they don't have, right? So that is a priority as well. But if you ask me, although all of these things are important, and of course public health is important, and so on and so forth, what should be the number one priority of in the world? For me, it would be to eliminate malnutrition, to make sure that we have a safety net in place across the entire planet that prevents young children from not having access to the resources that are necessary to develop their brains. And we don't have that today. I mean, it is a tragedy. We have a $100 trillion economy. We have countries, we have more wealth and more productive capacity than we have ever had in our entire history, certainly since the data has been collected, but I would guess probably going even further, thousands upon thousands of years, right? We have resources, we have plenty of the machinery that is necessary to prevent malnutrition, and yet, it happens every day, and it is a blight on our economic system, and it is a blight on our consciousness, really. Let me make a little editorial parenthesis here, all right? And those of you who know me know that sometimes, I can be candid in the way that I express myself. But I'm going to share with you something that I am sure you have read about in the media, right? But to me, it's a very dramatic example of the kind of excess that leads to, Abdul Bahá's condemnation of the extremes of wealth and poverty. There was a wedding that took place in India a few weeks ago of a very wealthy couple, Indian tycoon and his wife, who herself is related to a very prominent family. And apparently the wedding cost $600 million because, there were a week of festivities and people were brought in from all over the world in jets and so on, the sort of prominent politicians, celebrities and so on, right? $600 million in India, in a country that has hundreds of millions of people living on the edge of starvation, on the edge of subsistence, right? The Indians have developed this concept of karma. I think that the karma for this particular wedding is not a very good one, actually, it seems to me, right? Because it just dramatizes, the extremes to which we can see in the way that we allocate our resources, and also dramatizes the kind of lack of solidarity and the kind of indifference that we have towards the suffering and the needs of others, which again, in the writings, this notion of solidarity is very present there. When you talk about, when you see Abdul Bahá, as he travels in America, talk about the wealthy, he says wealth is commendable. If you prosper, if you become wealthy because of your knowledge, your skills, because you work hard, that is wonderful. That is to be encouraged, that is to be celebrated. But then he goes on to say that the wealthy should share their wealth, that the wealthy should have a conscience, that the wealthy should not go to sleep every night aware that there are unmet needs and that there are a lot of people who are suffering and who are hurting, such as the case with the mothers who cannot feed their children and make sure that they are not malnourished, right? So there is this kind of balance. On the one hand, he's giving us the green light to prosper and in fact, he's going beyond that. He's saying that if you, through the acquisition of skills and knowledge and training, not only prosper, but you serve humanity through your work as you prosper, that action of serving humanity, of working, is actually a form of worship. He says that it is like praying, right? So that I find particularly wonderful. But then he warns and he says, but you have to share some of your wealth. You have to be aware of the plight of others who have not been as lucky or as successful or who haven't had the opportunities that you have had, right? So that's very much part of the Baha'i approach to developing a more fair economic system. A couple more examples, because time is passing by and I don't want to tire you out. The whole question of gender. Gender is multidimensional subject, and most people, when people talk about gender or they think about gender, they are generally thinking about the human rights dimension of gender, right? They say, yes, of course, we Baha'is are in favor of gender equality because discriminating against women is a violation of her rights, because it is a violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which the vast majority of countries, members of the United Nations, have endorsed. It is a violation of the UN Charter, which explicitly recognizes the equality of the sexes, and so on and so forth. And that focus is entirely reasonable. And you see in the writings of the faith statements which support that particular interpretation of gender equality, right? But gender equality has other dimensions as well, and I just want to mention quickly in passing two of them. The second dimension has to do with the economic impact of gender discrimination, right? Not the human rights dimension, which, as I said, is very relevant and will always remain relevant. But no, I'm talking about what are the costs to society associated with discriminating against women in terms of prosperity. And there, the data is really overwhelming. I just could flood you with data because I have written an entire book with my dear friend Bahá'í on this subject, providing sort of the dozens and dozens of arguments, to frame the issue of gender equality in its economic dimension, right? But the data suggests, for instance, that when you educate girls and women, you are going to see an increase in the labor force participation rate of women. More women will integrate into the workforce. And this means that in families where the wife works, she has more of a say in how those resources are used. And the studies show that where women have more of a say on how the resources used, the family spends more money on education, the family spends more money on the health of the children, the family manages those resources more wisely in terms of savings, in terms of investment, and all of this has repercussions for economic growth, for prosperity, and so on, right? So another way of saying this is that basically by not educating girls or by discriminating against them in so many ways, societies pay a very heavy cost, right? If you ask me, why is it that Iran is such a basket case in terms of economics? Okay, the answer is multidimensional. There are many factors, including that the country is under sanctions because of its activities, disruptive activities in the Middle East and so on. But let me identify for you one aspect of why this is such an economic basket case. Iran has done, in the last 40 years, relatively good job of educating girls and young women. If you go to an Iranian university today in Tehran, you will see likely as many young women as young men in a classroom, and that is good, right? But it turns out that once they try to join the labor force, the laws, the regulations are completely stacked against women, which explains then why the labor force participation rate of men is 77% and of women is 17%, right? In other words, more than 50 percentage points lower. And the reason for that, and this is a study that we did at the World Bank by one of my teams, by the way, is that in Iran, we were able to identify 24 different kinds of legal restrictions in the Constitution, in the Civil Code, in family law, in the tax code, in the labor code, that essentially turn women into second-class citizens, right? And so the country is a basket case because half of the population are not being allowed to contribute what they could contribute to knowledge, to economic activity, and to modernizing the country, right? So here's a second dimension. And then a third dimension, which I'll just mention quickly in passing, has to do with security. Abdu'l-Baha specifically, in a talk that he gave in Pennsylvania in 1912, specifically established a linkage between peace in the world on the one hand and gender equality on the other. He said that until such time as women do not attain gender equality and do not have equal rights with men, the world that we live in will continue to be violent. It will continue to be torn by war. And we see this today. I regret to say, why is the security situation so toxic in the world today? Why is it that every time you open up your newspapers, there's report of violence and war taking place today, or threats of violence and threats of war, in the future? It's because we're basically living in a world that is run by men. The major decisions, whether we go to war, even on what terms we establish the peace, these decisions are made by men. And Abdu'l-Baha, 112 years ago, said, as if this situation persists, peace is going to be a very distant dream. And so this is, again, here is one area in which the Baha'i Faith takes very strong views, right? And takes the whole debate of gender equality to an additional dimension, which was not previously thought of, right? Which is, the whole question of security. Dear friends, as you can imagine, I can continue on. I have. Well, let me say one more thing. Which I think is important, and it goes back to that letter of Shoghi Effendi of 1931, right? The goal of a new world order. It's one of my favorite Shoghi Effendi letters, and the idea of the quote was that this is 1931. Just place yourself historically. It's the height of the Depression, which began in the United States, but then spread to other parts of the world, Europe, Australia. Sort of became a kind of a global cataclysmic economic depression. And Shoghi Effendi is basically saying, why is the world in this situation? Why is there this sense of disquiet, discomfort, in the world? You must understand, Shoghi Effendi was an extremely well-read head of our community. His wife, Amatul Baha Ruhiya Hanum, in that wonderful biography that he wrote of him, The Priceless Pearl, explains how Shoghi Effendi used to read, the latest, obviously had access to the latest media, the news, the newspapers. But beyond that, he liked to read those thinkers that were on the cutting edge of analyzing and understanding trends and the geopolitical and economic situation in the world. So he wasn't operating in a vacuum when making these statements. He was extremely well connected, to what was happening in the world, as was, of course, Abdul Baha before him. But Shoghi Effendi then in 1931 says that the condition why there is so much disquiet in the world is the failure of our economic and political institutions to adjust themselves to the needs of a rapidly evolving age, right? So he's saying our institutions need to modernize, they need to adjust. And what is really impressive about this quote is that he wrote this years and years before even the United Nations was created, right? So the system, the global governance system that we have today actually came out of a conference in San Francisco in 1945 at the end of World War II, where 51 nations adopted the UN Charter, right? So that is the system which we have today. That document, the UN Charter, has never been amended. It has been 79 years since it was adopted, and the world has changed dramatically in the meantime. We have a whole range of other problems that which we were not aware that we even had back in 1945, such as global warming and climate change, and sort of the Earth reaching its planetary limits on a whole range of fronts, from clean air to water to natural resources and so on and so forth. And so Shoghi Effendi is saying, no, this is not good enough. We need to modernize our institutional infrastructure. But not only does he identify the need, but then he goes on to say how they should be done. What are the institutions that should be created? And that is, in fact, the vision of global order, which he presents in that letter and in some of his other writings, right? And there is, just to encourage you a little bit, I just want to say that there is a lot of work being done in that space in recent years, because there is this increasing awareness that we are running up against very large, potentially catastrophic risks on the environment, on the security, on the inequality, which has muted into not just an economic problem, but also a political problem. And so I remain hopeful that in coming years, we're going to see a lot of initiatives which hopefully will materialize before before something else happens, which could be potentially more painful for all of humanity, right? For the Baha'is who are familiar with some of the statements produced by the House of Justice in 1945, I'm sorry, in 1985, the Universal House of Justice, the world governing body of the Baha'i community, wrote a statement called The Promise of World Peace, in which they basically sort of made an analysis of what are some of the factors which undermine the prospect for peace, but then went on and said something that was, I thought, quite insightful. They said that peace ultimately will come. Peace is inevitable. Humanity is headed in that direction. And the only thing that is really in question is whether that path to eventual peace will be the result of a consultative, concerted collaboration. Our leaders and our business community, our civil society organizations coming and working together, consulting and establishing, new institutions and doing this in a peaceful, evolutionary way, or whether it will simply come as a result of essentially the collapse of civilization and then a response to that, which of course would be very painful. It would be very inefficient. It would be very costly for humanity. All right? That's the choice. That's the choice. The end point, regardless of these two paths, is the same. There will be peace. There will be peace. And this is actually a promise that is implicit, not just in the Baha'i writings, it's implicit in the writings of all the world religions. It is, what does the kingdom of God on earth mean when you read the Bible? It's exactly that. It is the arrival of a stage in human evolution where finally we will have laid aside war permanently, and we will allocate our resources, to use the words of Baha'u'llah, to that which will be conducive to the happiness of mankind, right? That time will come, and what I cannot tell you, because I don't have a crystal ball, is whether will take the high-minded, collaborative, intelligent, constructive path, or whether we will take the painful path. Okay, friends, I stop here. I have probably overextended myself, for which I apologize.
No, not at all. Thank you so much. So now we have some time for Q&A, so people can put their questions in the chat. We already have some. So the first question is, every child should have the right and access to safe shelter, healthcare, and education. How does the Baha'i faith and social action we may develop achieve this?
Okay. Abdul Baha, well, let me step back a little bit. You may have heard of a debate that is taking place in academic circles, sometimes spilling over into the media, right, about the idea of establishing a kind of a minimum safety net, either in a particular country or some people think of the world, right? There is even a technical term for it. It's called universal basic income, right? Where every individual, simply by virtue of being born, independently of his capacity, independently of his nationality, his level of income, the wealth of his parents, and so on and so forth, simply by the very virtue of being born into this world, would receive a minimum set of let's say, you can think of it as a lump sum income, or you can think of it, as many countries do, in terms of services, right? So you have access to education, free education, at least through the end of high school. You have access to a public health system where whether you fall ill or not, is not, and what happens after that is not a function of your parents' income. It's just basically the state takes care of it, because the tax system has been organized in such a way as to provide public health to all, regardless of their social status, right? And it might involve, basic access to basic nutrition, for instance, and so on. This system already exists in many parts of the world, especially the high-income countries. Nobody dies of hunger in Norway. Nobody dies in a hospital because they can't pay their bills in Norway, right? And so on and so forth, right? And Abdu'l-Baha spoke. He didn't obviously he didn't use the term universal basic income, but the ideas that he put forward as he was traveling in America resonated with that concept, right? Of organizing the institutions, and specifically he referred to the tax system, organizing the tax system in a way that provides the resources so that the state can be empowered, to provide that safety net for all its citizens, so that we eliminate extreme poverty, right? So that idea is already implicit, right? And many people, when you present this idea to them, either as a Baha'i proposal or more generally as an academic proposal, because there are many academics who are putting forward this proposal, many people will tell you, no, it's not affordable. It would be too expensive. We don't have the resources within our national economy to provide for that level of services. And that particular argument I have generally found to be a very either ill-informed or dishonest, depending on where it comes from, right? For the following reason, that when you say that something is not affordable, you have to essentially argue that you have looked at the entire universe of expenditures that you have, right? Something may not be affordable because you're misspending and wasting money in other areas, right? So in light of that waste, you may not have enough resources to spend here and provide that minimum safety net, right? And as it turns out, we are wasting resources on a massive scale globally, right? Example, we don't have a system of collective security. So all countries in the world feel that they have to have an army, they have to have a navy, they have to have an air force, they have to buy weapons to defend themselves against their neighbors, right? That is an extremely inefficient way of providing security at the collective level. Baha'u'llah already laid out the principle of collective security in the 19th century. The United Nations Charter has in it the principle of collective security, but it has never been implemented. All right. So we need to move in that direction. And if we do, then resources will be released so that we do have the resources to prevent malnutrition, to prevent extreme poverty, to make it possible for everybody to have access to healthcare, regardless of their social status or the level of income of their parents.
Thank you. How does education and job opportunities and the ability to be financially independent contribute to gender equality?
Okay, there are many different dimensions to education, right? There is a very famous economist, Indian economist. He won the Nobel Economics Prize in the late 90s. His name is Amartya Sen. He's not just an economist, he's also a philosopher, one of the people that I admire the most. He actually has written a lot on gender equality, by the way, because his interests are very broad. And, he's a towering figure, both as an economist as a philosopher. I would encourage you to read some of his materials, some of which are very accessible. But he says, one of the reasons why you want people to be educated, to have access to, to be able to read and write to begin with, which is the first level, right? But beyond that, to be able to, understand the newspapers that they read, to have access to information and so on and so forth. It's not just that by being educated, you can acquire skills which then allow you, to join the labor force and to contribute in some meaningful way, right? Not just to build your country, but also to provide income for yourself and your family, right? But he identifies a second dimension of education. He says that you want people to be educated, to be well-informed, to be well-read, because then they can identify the crooked politicians who are misguiding them and are telling them all kinds of nonsense as they pursue their demagoguery and their desire, to achieve power, right? He says that when people are not educated, they are vulnerable to the manipulations of the demagogues. They believe things that are told to them because they don't have the capacity to distinguish truth from falsehood, because they don't have access to the relevant information, because they haven't received the training in the kind of thinking that is necessary to identify the lies of the demagogues, right? And to me, that is a very, very important aspect of education, is to empower people so that in the context of democratic societies, when they have to go to the polls and vote for somebody, they will vote for somebody who's not providing, a warped vision of reality because of the demagoguery and because of their political ambition, right? So that to me is a very, very important element. And in The Secret of Divine Civilization, Abdu'l-Baha talks about the importance of expanding the frontiers of knowledge, right? Education is partly empowering people so that they can operate on the frontiers of knowledge, right? Not 10 miles inside, right? Think of you're operating inside of a behind the line. The line is the frontier of knowledge, right? It's the cutting edge. It's where we are in terms of science, in terms of our political systems, and so on. And Abdu'l-Baha says that is where we want to take people. We want to take them to the frontiers of knowledge. We want them to have access to information. We want it to be intelligent, to have an intelligent understanding of what is happening in the world, right? Abdu'l-Baha doesn't say, because if they don't, crooked politicians will take advantage of them. Amartya Sen says that, but it's a logical conclusion. It's a logical extension, right? And that to me is a very important aspect of education, right? And it is the reason why we want to invest in education, right? And unfortunately, even in wealthy countries, the educational systems are very, very flawed. And I think the United States is a very, very good example of that. The United States is falling behind in terms of the quality of education. And there are objective sort of statistics that actually show you this, right? Just like in the United States, average life expectancy is declining, right? The United States spends vast amounts of money in health, in public health, and yet the outcomes for that spending in terms of life expectancy, in terms of infant mortality, in terms of teenage pregnancy are horrible, right? So there you go.
Thank you. Yeah, that's an interesting aspect of education we don't think of how, our ability to be informed about our policies is really where we get our power. There's a question of what is the date of Shoghi Effendi's letter that you're referring to?
The goal of a new world order. I don't have the exact page reference, but the goal of a new world order is a short. Actually, let me. Can I put on a little personal pitch here? Okay. A very prominent publisher, Routledge, recently, maybe a year or so ago, published an entire volume of something like 30 essays on the Baha'i Faith. This is very unusual, right? It's a commercial publisher, an academic publisher that invited a bunch of Baha'is to essentially provide a kind of an overview of different dimensions of the Baha'i Faith, its history, its administration, and its teachings in particular areas and so on. And I was invited to write the chapter on economics, right? So for those of you who are interested, I can make available that chapter to Peymane, and then Peymane, you are entirely free to distribute it, okay? Because some of the ideas which I have presented in this presentation are actually inspired by some of the things I wrote there. And in fact, a couple of the quotes which I read to you come from that chapter, all right?
Great, that would be amazing. Yeah, you could share it with me, and I can share it with this video later on when we distribute it to everyone.
Yeah.
The next question is, are you aware of any countries or international, national, or regional institutions that are asking the question of how should we change ourselves to reflect the principles of equity and other key principles of the faith?
To repeat the last few words.
How should we change ourselves to reflect the principles of equity and other key principles of our faith?
I think that there are many countries in the world that are, struggling to move in that direction, where the politicians and the political system is very well motivated, where the levels of corruption are already quite low, and where you have a cadre of public servants, from the prime ministers down to members of Congress, that are very much identified with the public good and are struggling and trying to to serve the public good. Okay, I have traveled all over the world because the jobs that I have had have been with international organizations. So I have been to every continent, every corner of the world, right? And let me give a little anecdote to illustrate a point, right? A couple of years ago, I was in Sweden. I was invited by the foreign minister, Miss Margot Wallström, who, in addition to being foreign minister, is one of the leading voices in the country on the subject of gender equality, right? And she had organized this seminar to talk about gender discrimination, and how could Sweden support the gender equality agenda in other parts of the world, right? And this meeting was held in a very handsome palace in Stockholm, right? It's like a museum. It used to be the home of a very wealthy Swedish industrialist, and it has been converted into a public meeting house, where they have seminars and so on and so forth. Well, when I got to the meeting, one of the ministers arrived in riding his bicycle. Okay. Now, why is that significant? Why did I look at that and I smiled a little bit? And I have to, if I have to sort of confess, I had within me a kind of a grudging admiration for that, right? Why? Well, because I was born in a developing country, and if you go to my country today, right, when the minister goes to his office, he usually drives a limousine. It usually is followed by 5 other cars, 10 motorcycles, and they stop the traffic in the city, right? Even though this is a very poor country, right? So there is this kind of inverse correlation, right? Now, Sweden, I would say, is one of those countries where there are very low levels of corruption in the government, where the public servants are honest and dedicated, by and large, to the public good, right? Now, Abdu'l-Baha specifically talks about this issue in The Secret of Divine Civilization. He talks about public servants. He talks about corruption. He talks about honesty and integrity as being drivers of economic prosperity, right? He talks about how the public servant should be entirely focused on serving the people, not on his, using the public office as an opportunity for self-enrichment, you see? And so the answer to your question is yes, there are many countries where you already have governments and public servants that are committed to not just honest governance, which is absolutely essential for economic prosperity, but actually these are countries that are also very generous in how much of their wealth they share to other countries. Countries like the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Iceland are extremely generous. They allocate a big chunk of their budget to, poverty alleviation in Africa, to promoting gender equality in other parts of the world, and so on. So that encourages me. It means that it can be done. We don't all have to be corrupt and kleptocrats, which unfortunately is the reality in many parts of the world. And usually, the poorer the country, the more corruption there is, and the more kleptocratic the regime. Right? You have countries in Africa where the head of state has a Boeing 707, right, which is a very large aircraft, that he can use. He has been bought with state resources, so he can use when he travels around visiting his other buddies in other countries in Africa. And these are countries that have very high infant mortality rates, very high levels of malnutrition, right? So let me ask you, where is the justice in that, all right? And does it surprise you that many of these countries are increasingly ungovernable? Why? Because people are not stupid. People in an age in which people have access to information, everybody knows that the head of state has a huge private aircraft, and they resent that because they see the needs of their children, because they see that they don't have access to good food and to electricity, and therefore they sabotage the government if they can, and that's why you have political instability. And again, I go to my source. Abdul Baha, in a talk that he gave in America in 1912, said the following: if the problem of inequality is not addressed, he didn't say inequality, he said extremes of wealth and poverty, but it's exactly the same. If this problem is not addressed and it is allowed to persist, it will undermine the basis of society.
Thank you. The next question is, the US spent $152 trillion in 60 years to armaments and wars. How can Baha'is be involved in a nonpartisan way to address this to society and the government?
What is the reference to the $150 trillion? Sorry.
$152 trillion in 60 years to armaments and wars.
Well, I want to be careful here, right? I'm not saying that there is no room for spending in security, right? First of all, a particular country's situation may vary, right? Depending on your neighborhood, depending on how many neighbors you have who wish ill on you. And there are many parts of the world where there are such countries, all right? And so they need to spend because if they don't, on weapons and so on, because if they don't, they could be very vulnerable to attacks from people who have evil intentions against them, all right? But those are specific cases. They tend to be isolated cases. In general, we're spending far too much money on defense, military establishments, all right? And the quote that I shared with you, which comes from that article, which I will send you, Paimone, which you can share, right? It specifically quotes from Abdul Baha on the unfairness, right, of spending vast monies preparing for war and so on against the needs of an impoverished population, right? So what is the solution to this? I think the solution to this has to be systemic. You basically have to come up with a system that provides security in a collective basis. What does that mean? It basically means that there is an agreement among all the nations of the world, right? That, for instance, we're going to have an international peace force attached to the United Nations, right? To which all the member countries are going to contribute. And this international peace force will act in the interests of the collectivity. And so when a tyrant, a warmonger in country X wants to invade the country of his neighbor because of greed or because of resentment or because of some other factors, then the international community will use this instrument called the International Peace Force to basically tell the tyrant, hey, either you stop or we will come in and stop you from invading and from doing the things that you want to do, right? That is collective security, right? I mean, Baha'u'llah describes this very explicitly in one of his tablets, right? We don't have that system in place. And to run that system would be incredibly cheaper than having 193 countries developing their own, weapons industries and armies and navies and air forces and so on and so forth, right? So the system that we have today induces waste, induces far more military and far more weapons than are necessary to keep the peace in the world, all right? So the solution has to be systemic. The problem is not conceptual. We know what needs to be done. The problem is one of political will. The problem is one of, moving from this system where there are a lot of vested interests. That we have entire industries that hire hundreds of thousands of people who are in the production of weapons. So how do you deal with those, right? So it's going to have to be a process. We're going to have to wean ourselves away gradually over time from, our military industrial complex, which is very big in especially the big countries, and we're going to have to reallocate those resources to other industries, to health, to education, to arts and other things that, to use the words of Baha'u'llah, are conducive to the happiness of mankind, right? So it can be done. It's going to be painful. It will probably take decades to do it, but we have to start somewhere, right? Because the current system is not sustainable. The current system is going to end up where Abdul Baha said in 1912 we ended up, right? I mean, where he actually was predicting World War II, World War I. I'm sorry, it happened within a couple of years. I think if Abdul Baha was alive today and he was, traveling in America, visiting some of the same places that he visited back then, he would be alarmed at the condition of the world today and the risks that we're facing because of this overemphasis on military aspects of security. Dear friends, thank you very much. It has been a pleasure to be with you today. It is always fun to participate in these conversations. And what else can I say? Blessings to you, and have a wonderful weekend. Right?
Thank you so much. And just one last thing. What is the name of the book that you wrote the chapter in?
I don't have it in front of me, but if you're willing to wait 30 seconds, I can go to my bookcase and literally show you the cover of the book. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, wait 30 seconds. I'll bring it over.
Okay, great. And while he's doing that, I'll just announce our speaker for next week. It will be Seema Ghodrati, and her topic will be In God's Image and Nature's Design, All Must Surge, but Youth Must Soar.
Okay. The title of the book is The World of the Baha'i Faith. It is edited by Robert Stockman, and I can show you the cover here. And I'm looking at the index just to whet your appetite, because it's actually a very good compilation by very important people. There's a chapter on the writings and teachings of the Bab by Nader Saidi, who is one of our most prominent scholars on the Bab, right? There is a chapter on the writings of Baha'u'llah by Stephen Phelps, whom you may have heard of. There is something on the writings and the speeches of Abdul Baha by Mina Yazdani, who's another very prominent scholar. Let me see. There's something like a couple of dozen essays. There is something on artistic expression. There is something on the environment and sustainability by Arthur Dahl. There is something on marriage and family life by Wendy Momin, who is originally an American Baha'i, but she's lived in England for a long time. There is something by Mujan Momin, her husband, who's a very prominent scholar, and so on. And in that volume, I was asked to write the chapter on economics, which I'm happy to share, right? But this is it's an expensive book, by the way, because it's an academic publication. The publisher is Routledge, and it's available on Amazon, but you're gonna get a sticker shock when you go to Amazon and try to buy it, right? For that reason, I'm happy to share with you the PDF of my chapter on economics, right? But here it is. Okay, friends, that was the show and tell part of the talk. So thank you, and best wishes to all.
Thank you.
Yes, by the way, on September 19, there will be a series of very interesting events in the offices of the Baha'i International Community in New York, where the Global Governance Forum, which is the organization that I am directing, will be releasing a revised version of the United Nations Charter. What the United Nations Charter should look like in the 21st century in light of the changes that have taken place over the last 80 years. And this is I'll send Paimene the flyer that has a link where you can register and you can attend some of these events, okay, in case you're interested. All right. So I had to send two things to Paimene, the link to these events and the chapter. I will do that shortly.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I put the link to our contact form on our YouTube channel. So we'll be posting this video there afterwards and you can subscribe for free. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you next week. Bye.